And the results were pretty striking. It showed that Latter-day Saint LGBT youth were just about half as likely, just over half as
Wow.
likely as non-Latter-day Saint LGBT youth to experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So that includes thoughts, plans, and attempts of suicide. And this was highly
So
statistically significant. It's a big sample, and it actually persists when in the other study. Persists when controlling for demographic variables as well.
hey, everybody, and welcome to this continuing conversation that we are having with Tom Stringham. Tom Stringham is currently a PhD student in economics at the University of Toronto. Welcome again, Tom.
Thank you.
By the way, I have to admit to everyone that I have a soft spot for economists. Economists tend to deal in facts, and one of my great intellectual heroes is Thomas Sowell. I would probably consider him my economic intellectual icon. So I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I've read, it's been a long time, but one or two of his books. Conflict of Visions, I think I read.
I haven't read that one.
It's good. Yeah. No, he's brilliant, obviously. He's still around, right? He's very old.
I know he's like a million years old.
Yeah. But yeah, brilliant guy.
Any economists you in particular are fond of?
That's a great question. I have a good supervisor. She's a great economist, but no, not really.
Well, before we get into the subject matter too, I did want to kind of just take a look at this. You being an economist, what skill set does being an economist bring to the table when dealing with social phenomena?
Sure. I don't really think of myself as an economist. Maybe at some point I will. But my sort of subfield is econometrics that I study. So that's sort of applied statistics. The methods. So I study the methods that economists use and try to develop new methods. So how it relates or how it might be useful is just an understanding of statistics and how to look at data and what can be inferred and what can't be inferred from data.
Excellent. Well, that will definitely come in handy because there is a lot of narrative out there in the world, and data, in my opinion, holds more sway than narrative. But that's just me. So let's get into it. So you recently wrote a piece for Public Square magazine. Explain a little bit about what Public Square is.
Sure. So it's actually the first time I've written for them, and maybe I'm not the best person to pitch for them, but they haven't been around very long. I want to say just a couple of years, but it's an online. Oh, sorry, my kids have woken up.
No, you're fine.
It's an online magazine from a Latter-day Saint perspective, where they have a lot of contributors who look at social issues and theology and science and religion and all sorts of things. Jacob Hess, I think he's the top guy there.
I think he's the head editor there.
Yeah, that's right. And he's a psychologist and has a lot of really interesting things to say. So it's a really good magazine.
Yeah, I loved it, and that's why I want to kind of plug it, because I'm a big fan of Public Square Mag. They have great articles in there for thoughtful Latter-day Saints, and this one was dealing with the subject of LGBT suicide in the state of Utah. So we'll dig right into that. And if you need to take care of the baby or something, you're fine to do that. I don't know if you want to do that. We can
my wife's got it. It's just my son's awake. She's got it.
You're good. You're good. It happens. I got 4 kids myself. Anyway, so let's jump right into this. So in the article, I'm just going to quote. It says, in December 2014, a national media outlet printed an off-the-cut remark from an LGBT advocate who claimed that Mormons have the highest rate of gay suicide in the country. Why is this such a common and unquestioned perspective? After all, doesn't Utah have one of the highest suicide rates in the nation?
So, yeah, it is a very common and widely believed idea, and there are kernels of truth. Utah does have a high suicide rate. I think it's fifth or sixth right now among states. There was one point at which it might have been first several years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and so I mean, obviously that's cause for concern. And one of the reasons for that we understand from social science is that for some reason high altitude states and high altitude locales have higher rates of suicide. We see that consistently. So Alaska and Colorado and Utah and Montana, these states all just have higher suicide rates. So
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the story with Utah. But regardless, for some reason Utah does have high suicide rates. Um, so combine that with the fact that suicide rates have been rising in the U.S. over
Mm-hmm.
the last couple of decades, and combine that with the fact that LGBT people and LGBT youth in particular have higher rates of suicide than other people, something like twice as high, depending on
Mm-hmm.
the metric you're using. And you combine all those things, and you can see how people can start to think, well, I'm noticing there are a lot of LGBT people who have committed suicide or have attempted suicide here in Utah, and it seems to be a real problem here. Maybe there's something to do with it. Maybe the church is contributing to this or causing these suicides. And I can see how people, might have. I think it's a reasonable conjecture.
Mm-hmm.
It's not out of nowhere. So I think that's sort of where it came from. And there were some, high profile, I guess I'd say, early cases. I think there was one in 2012 where it was a member of the church, or there was some perception that it had to do with being a member of the church, and so from there sort of the narrative was born. So I think that's where it comes from, and the specific quote that you mentioned from 2014. So that was she was an advocate and had been corresponding with a lot of people who knew people who had suicidal feelings or attempts and those sort of things. So that was sort of her perspective, was sort of an on the ground sense that there was a problem.
Yeah, but obviously she's saying that Mormons have the highest rate of gay suicide in the country. That seems like something that we could verify as true or false in the data itself. So you've looked into this data in some detail, and that was, got you writing this article. What does the data actually say?
So yeah, this someone mentioned this article to me, and I thought this is really quite a striking fact if it's true, if members of the church have the highest rate of gay suicide. And so I looked into it and found that there was no such data that could be used to answer that question. We just didn't have any data that cut that finely. And I wrote a blog post to that effect, just saying we don't have any data to say whether this is true. I'm not sure where this came from, this claim, and the data that does exist would make it seem unlikely that this is the case. So, for example, religiosity tends to have a protective effect against suicide, including for LGBT people.
And that's kind of broadly understood already in the scientific literature on suicide, that religion is helpful.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so this claim in 2014, there just wasn't any evidence either way, and the evidence that did exist made it seem unlikely that this would be the case, but we needed more data. And this provoked a response, and she did end up actually saying she had misspoken and didn't mean to make such a specific claim.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where it was left for a long time. There wasn't a lot of good data, but the narrative, kept going full steam. So,
and then so eventually, data has been collected on this, and people began to look into it. And actually, before I go into that, I actually, you were saying that at that time that this claim was made, there wasn't really good data on it, and I had understood that Michael Staley, who I believe is with the Utah Health Department, who basically is in charge of counting and analyzing suicide data, said basically the same thing you did. He's like, no one should be making a claim that the church is driving people to suicide because we just don't have the data. Like that doesn't exist. But Then they began to do the research on that data, and you've looked into some of that, and you begin to go into some of that in your paper. So what was found in the data and the studies that when they started to look into this?
Right. So the two papers that sort of came out recently, and I had no involvement with either of them. I just read them, but they are looking at survey data from Utah. So this is a big representative survey data set collected by the state of Utah from middle school and high school students.
Mm-hmm.
And in the latest iterations of the survey, they have included a lot of questions that are really helpful for sort of getting at this phenomenon. So they ask about sexual orientation, they ask about religion, and they ask about suicidality, so suicidal thoughts, plans of suicide, and attempts of suicide. So these two studies, there's one that was done by researchers from, I want to say, the University of Kentucky at Bowling Green, or Bowling Green University, or
Mm-hmm.
I should have checked
so
originally.
Regardless, it isn't like some group of people from the church or something are doing the study.
No, and the impression I got was the results were surprising to the researchers in that study. So it didn't seem like they had an agenda to defend the church. But I mean, go ahead and read the study and see what you think. But
and I'll link that study and your article in the description of this video.
Sure, yeah. So that study was more descriptive, and so they looked at the data and said, what is the relationship between suicidality and religion for LGBT youth and non-LGBT youth, and so what are the predictors of suicide, and is being a Latter-day Saint one of them? And the results were pretty striking. It showed that Latter-day Saint LGBT youth were just about half as likely, just over half as likely as non-Latter-day Saint LGBT youth to experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So that includes thoughts, plans, and attempts of suicide. And this was highly statistically significant. It's a big sample, and it actually persists when in the other study. Persists when controlling for demographic variables as well.
Okay, and so basically, in layman's terms, what this is saying is that if someone is LGBT and they also happen to identify as a Latter-day Saint, they're half as likely to report any sort of suicidal thoughts or behavior. Is that a fair summation of what the study found?
Compared to non-Latter-day Saint LGBT youth, yeah. So and that's not a and that's a descriptive statement. So that's not applying a model and trying to infer causation. That's just descriptive. So there could be confounding variables and all that sort of thing. But regardless, it makes it less plausible to say that the church is causing suicides when you see this negative statistical relationship. It's quite strong and quite big. And the second,
go ahead.
Yeah, and the second study was using the same data set. Uh-huh. This was by researchers at BYU, and they sort of took a deeper dive into the data, looking not just at descriptive statistics, but also trying to model some of these outcomes. And the results are consistent with the other study. So I mentioned that when you control for demographic variables, these relationships persist. And they've also found that much of the difference was mediated by the fact that Latter-day Saint youth have lower levels of substance abuse. They have lower levels of family conflict at home, better relationships with family, and that explained much of the gap.
Interesting. So basically, because of not only the fact that they are Latter-day Saint, which we've said that the data generally show that if you're religious, your likeliness of suicide goes down, but because of a lack of substance abuse, because of stability in their family relationships, that kind of stuff actually causes it to go down. This seems to fly totally in the face of the narrative that it's mean family members at home rejecting their gay children because the church tells them to hate them. That's why the suicide rate's going on. I mean, this is the exact opposite. The data seems to be saying the exact opposite. Yeah,
it's not what you would expect if you were in the mindset of the narrative that's been popular online since the mid-2010s. And as you say, the narrative has been, that families are rejecting their gay kids, and throwing them out into the street, and that these kids are going and committing suicide.
So, and now here's the thing. I think both of us can admit that sort of thing can happen. And indeed, there are family members who reject their gay, children and things like that. And you and I are of the same opinion, I assume, in saying that's horrible, that's wrong, that's not what we teach, and those people will be held accountable for such abusive and wrong behavior. Can we agree on that? I assume we're on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that isn't to say that there won't ever be a case, but I guess the idea is that would be not because of the church, but in spite of the church, that those sorts of things are happening.
Right. It seems like in this data, at least which is in Utah, so at least among high school and middle school students in Utah, LGBT kids who are Latter-day Saints tend to have better experiences with their families than other kids, and this seems to help explain the lower rates of suicidal thoughts and behaviors.
That's interesting. So there was one other quote from your article I'd like to read. It said, when it came to depression, LGBT youth benefited more from being Latter-day Saints relative to having no religion than straight youth did. In fact, straight Latter-day Saint youth had a higher estimated rate of depression than Catholics and Protestants, once controls were included. The same was not true of gay Latter-day Saints. So what's one to take away from this? What's the implication?
Yeah, so this is just something that stood out to me from the BYU paper, and it's striking because it's not just saying that Latter-day Saint LGBT youth are doing better than non-Latter-day Saint LGBT youth. It's actually saying that when it comes to depression, at least, the church might even be doing more good for gay youth than it is for straight youth, compared to having no religion. And this is just one finding, and it would need to be replicated, and there's more study that would need to really confirm that this is a real causal phenomenon. But it's the opposite of what we should expect, again, if this narrative is true. And so while with social science data, it's hard to prove causation. You can only ever really do it provisionally and cautiously. But one thing that you can do a little bit easier is sort of rule out theories that just really contradict the data. And in this case, it's hard to see how the prevailing narrative really fits with this data.
Yeah, no, for sure. It flies right in the face of it. And I myself have, when this narrative started, I immediately had my doubts about it. And not obviously because I have bias, but also because it didn't make sense to me. Because if people are going to say it's the rhetoric of the church that's driving these people to suicide, I go, well, wait a minute. I've watched the rhetoric change over the course of my life, and there's an inverse relationship. It seems that as suicide is gone up, the rhetoric has been softer, softer, softer. And when the rhetoric was the worst, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, like it was really rough rhetoric back then, yet there was no big thing with suicide. So in my mind, there just was wait, this doesn't make sense, on just kind of a logical level. And then the other thing I just looked at, just because I always do this when people talk about Utah, is this idea of, well, Utah has X problem, therefore Mormons. And that's sort of like, well, first of all, only about 30% of Utah are even active members of the church. So that's a problem. But what you can do, at least what I do in my kind of rough economist way, I just like to look at the county by county data, because the levels of Latter-day Saints within Utah vary from county to county fairly significantly. And a quick snapshot is just look at Utah County, look at Salt Lake County. And yet when we do that, what we find is that the suicide rates are higher in Salt Lake, not in Utah County, which to me goes, wait a minute here. In other words, when I actually drill into Utah, the correlation between the Latter-day Saints and the suicide falls apart.
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
That's I always kind of tell people, look, if you're going to look at Utah, go down one level lower to see if the correlation is there. Because as a general rule, I have found all the bad stuff seems to correlate more to Salt Lake County, and all the good stuff tends to correlate more to, even when things aren't, it's a bad thing in general, it's always worse in Salt Lake.
Yeah, it's doing state level analysis in the U.S. is really is risky. You can run into some. It's easy to make incorrect inferences if you're just looking at state level averages and trying to draw conclusions. So yeah,
Absolutely.
going down another level is definitely helpful. And then in this case, with this data, we have individual level data, which is great because then we were able to control. You can control for a number of variables.
Yeah, and it seems like at every level of analysis, we basically are coming up with the same result. That this narrative just is not true based on what the data tells us. It's more narrative driven, and not to discount the really truly sad stories that are out there, but a sad story, an anecdote, is not something that you can utilize rationally to make broad conclusions about a social phenomena, right?
Right. Yeah. Rules and exceptions exist, and it seems like as a rule, our youth are doing a little better than others. There are exceptions to that, I'm sure. And for some people, they might have a really bad experience in the church for whatever reason. But as a rule, the narrative doesn't seem to be supported by the data, and I think it's quite unlikely to be true.
Absolutely. So as we look a little critically at these studies, though, if I'm looking at these and I go, well, all right, so you got some study by BYU, we really going to trust what BYU has to say about their church? Like, how is this reliable? So what would you say to someone who has that sort of an attitude?
Yeah, I mean that's fair. So first of all, the other study, like I said, isn't from BYU, so you can take a look at that and see the results, and they're quite consistent with the BYU results. Um, the researchers in the BYU study, I read the paper. I think they did a good job. They covered their bases. They responded to potential criticisms and were open about weaknesses. And it's more of a general, if you don't trust BYU, I guess you don't trust BYU. But this is, it's easy to say that about anything BYU does that connects to the church. So I would just say read the study and see what you think. It's data that comes from the state of Utah, so it's a very big, reliable, representative data set. There's not much that you could do um, to manipulate that kind of data. Um, but again, just the paper's available, so go
Yeah,
take
and
a
people
look.
can look in and look at the actual methods and see if there's something wrong with the way that they did the study. Now, with that in mind, you did take a critical look at the studies yourself, and you even pointed out, and I'll quote, one possible explanation of these findings is that LGBT youth most likely to be harmed by the church teachings are also those who are most likely to have already left the church, thus pushing rates of suicidal thoughts and behaviors lower in the Latter-day Saint group and higher in the non-Latter-day Saint group. Or in other words, the people that are having suicidal thoughts, they have already left the church. Like that, if you're being hurt by someone, you're going to leave, and that residual damage, then they go and commit suicide. But at that time, they aren't identifying themselves as a Latter-day Saint. So you have, survivorship bias, right? So you explored that. Does that not invalidate these data?
So this is something that the BYU study looked at directly. Um, so they acknowledge the possibility of survivorship bias, and they happened. I'm not sure what the story is, but they happen to have good data on um, people who have left the church, including by sexual orientation and by religiosity and by suicidality. So they have this sort of auxiliary data set they were able to use, and to say that if we take the numbers from that data and we take the minimum likely value and the maximum, and we see what the maximum possible effect this could have on our data. They came up with I don't want to misquote, but basically, it's very unlikely that survivorship bias could be explaining this big of a gap in the data. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
seem like that's what's going on.
So while there may be some portion of that, they were able to analyze it sufficiently to say, look, you don't get this big of a gap without some real, uh, correlation going on here.
Yeah, the rates of suicidality in the group that had left the church would have had to be extraordinarily um, higher than you saw in the auxiliary data to explain this gap. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. So, but some people might hear this and they're like, all right, fine. We can make data say whatever we want. I've heard these terrible stories and I know somebody who went through this or that. And I'm not discounting that people do have those very real experiences. What would you say to those people?
I mean, those stories, both can be true in a sense, right? So both personal stories and data are valid sources of truth, but they come at different questions and they answer different questions. So as I said before, both rules and exceptions exist, and the fact that someone actually, one comparison I made, and maybe this is a little too explosive these days, but if you look at vaccines, I mean, some people have bad experiences with vaccines. On the other hand, broadly they're very safe as far as I have read the data. And the fact that some people have bad experiences doesn't mean they're not safe, and the fact that they're safe doesn't mean some people haven't had really bad experiences. Both these things can be true, and so we have to be able to say, if we're looking at population trends and we're looking at the rules, personal stories probably don't reflect much on that. There's probably not much we can infer from a single story or even a number of stories, unless it's systematically gathered so that we can, evaluate it with statistical theory. So, so that's what I'd say is if you want to know what happened in a particular person's life, then absolutely, their account of what happened is the most important thing. If you want to know what is happening in the bigger picture and whether this is a real phenomenon broadly in the church, then I think look to the data and the best the best data we have right now.
Absolutely. So to kind of sum up, what should a person take away when they read your article that you wrote? What are you hoping that they take away from it?
So I guess what I want people to take away is let's avoid perpetuating narratives when we don't know if they're true or when we don't have good reason to think that they're true. I think it's hard to overstate just how big this narrative got online in church adjacent spaces in the mid 2010s to the late 2010s. It's sort of calmed down a little bit as people have sort of encountered these objections, but it was a really big narrative, and I think it did a lot of damage. And national news outlets ran stories based on these unverified reports, and some that turned out to be false or fabricated. And it's really unfortunate. So I would say when there is a really viral narrative, even if it makes a lot of sense intuitively, take a step back and think this is really something I want to repeat without clear caveats. So that would be the biggest thing. I'm not going to say, I don't want people to take away that I'm saying this narrative is false, although I suspect it is. I'm saying it's very unlikely to be true. The data that exists make it very unlikely to be true. And I think this is my last takeaway probably, is there are other narratives about youth and suicide that I think would be more worthy of our time and attention, other things we can investigate.
Absolutely. And just if you don't mind, what I'm curious what some of those might be. You kind of baited out there. I know we've been talking a little while, but I'm interested in hearing what are some of the alternative narratives that are out there that you think are people should be aware of or that could be compelling.
So I think that we should explore whether secularization is contributing to higher suicide rates. I mean, as we see from these two studies, that kids raised without religion did about the worst of any group. We should investigate whether secularization is contributing to rising suicide rates, particularly among young people. I think we should investigate. So Jacob Hess has pointed this out, but antidepressants. So antidepressants sold in the U.S. have a black box warning that says for people under about 25 or so, there is a risk, a statistically significant risk from randomized controlled trials that of higher rates of suicidal thoughts and behavior. So antidepressants in young people, there is evidence from clinical trials that it can cause suicidal thoughts and behavior. And there was sort of a cultural shift in Utah around 2013, 2014 towards, we think, towards prescribing more antidepressants to young people in particular. And it was all out of the best intentions. In fact, it sort of followed talks by church leaders suggesting make sure to seek mental health help if you need it, which is true. But it seems to have led to a shift in how we think about antidepressants in youth, which may have had some side effects. So I don't know that that's the case, but I think it's something worth exploring.
And I've always found an interesting thing where people talk about antidepressant rate use in Utah, which again is higher, I believe, in Salt Lake County than in Utah County, but I digress. But I will say that the other really interesting thing is that we don't self-medicate. There's a lot of people who will self-medicate with alcohol and drugs and other things, and people who don't do that are more likely to actually go and get prescribed medication to treat their depression instead of just going down to the local bar and drinking their problems away, which is kind of the American MO and time immemorial for the way that you deal with the blues.
Right.
And so I don't think it's necessarily a great comparison that way. But you brought up something interesting. You brought up, secularization and the effects on suicide. And we talked about the idea of religiosity generally having it helps prevent people from becoming suicidal. And as I've explored that, one of the things we aren't realizing also is that a lot of times this the LGBT kind of realization also triggers a faith crisis. That there's a correlation there. When people become or recognize their same-sex attraction, their whole world gets spun around, and a lot of times they lose their faith. And maybe there is something to be looked at there to see how much that, because if religion does have an effect, then we know that there is good reason to believe that religiosity helps protect. If they lose that it would actually exacerbate the situation beyond the things that they're already going through. So
yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's possible. Yeah, it's something to look into, and maybe it could be examined through, this auxiliary data set that looks at people who have left the church.
I think there's a whole abundance of things that could be looked at there with some really interesting implications. Because another thing that I think that has changed. I have a relative who's older, who's gay. I have like 5 different relatives who've come out as gay or lesbian, and the one who is older had a very different sort of experience than the ones who are younger. The younger came out into this world that basically immediately began to feed them this narrative of, hey, everybody who is a member of the church hates you. They'll say they love you, but they don't really love you. And they won't, if they don't change their religious belief, they don't love you. And that's sort of constantly being whispered in their ear. And I wonder personally, what are you doing to them? You're telling them that all the people in their life that's closest to them, their family, their friends, all these people that they grew up with, that they hate them? Even if they say they don't and try it's like, no, they don't accept you. And, how much of an effect does that have on someone's psyche? How alone do you feel if you really believe that? If you take that into your heart and you begin to see your parents and your brothers and sisters and your friends and your community that everyone hates you, like that. And that seems to be the narrative that the younger generations in my family have gotten from society, that this older relative of mine did not. And this older relative of mine doesn't have hostility towards the church in any way or towards those who are in it. So I just kind of thought, and again, that's just an anecdote, so I'll fully recognize that. But I thought it was an interesting thing to consider. And again, maybe data will verify or discount that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I've had similar thoughts too. That, it's possible that these narratives have actually made things worse. And often it was pointed out during the years that this narrative was so big that a lot of the best practices for how to talk about suicide were not being followed. You're not supposed to reduce it to a single factor. You're not supposed to try to justify, and tell stories that would justify other people committing suicide. There were a lot of ways that people were talking about this phenomenon in ways that would be counterproductive if you were trying to really prevent suicide. And you bring up a related point of this narrative. Well, a related point, not necessarily to do with the best practices, but just another way that narratives could be counterproductive. And that's another reason to just be cautious and make sure that you're really sure about what you're saying and you have good reason to be saying it.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very serious topic. It's a topic that people have the worst possible thing is to lose a loved one in this way. I mean, I can't imagine much worse, and the guilt and everything that people feel. Already, anytime you're dealing with an LGBT situation, it's a real challenge for people, and then to throw on top of that suicide. I mean, it's about as hard as it gets. So what you personally, what advice would you give to someone who has an LGBT family member?
What I say, I mean, I would just speak from, what am I trying to say? I don't think I have much of a unique perspective to give apart from what I could say about, this data and these studies and these sorts of things. And what these studies would say is, substance abuse is a factor that contributes to this gap. And that family relationships are really important. So if there's family conflict at home, that tends to elevate risk of suicidal thoughts and behavior. Good relationships with parents tend to reduce that risk. And so the absolute most important thing, to my, as far as it seems to me, is keeping close relationships with your kids if they're still at home or if they're not still at home, and trying to keep a peaceful, happy home where people can feel safe. I think that's very straightforward advice, but that would be probably the main thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree 100%. So any final thoughts before we sign on? Did you feel like you were able to explain the things you needed to explain?
I think so, yeah. I appreciate you inviting me on. And also, check out the other 3 articles in this series. So this article ended up being part of a series called Scary Stories About Utah. And so there are several others that looked at sort of popular narratives about how Utah has high rates of antidepressant use and plastic surgery and those sorts of things. So
yeah,
check out the other articles as well.
I'll definitely link those in the description as well, along with your article. Thank you so much for writing it. Honestly, it was like, holy smokes, this is a game changer that takes that narrative and just turned it totally on its head for me. And I appreciate you writing it and for coming on and talking with me about it tonight.
Thanks, Jacob. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care, Tom.
You too.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you want more content, including the podcast, go to thoughtful-faith.com. Thanks for watching.